Clara Whitaker grew up at the far edge of a two-lane road where the pavement gave up and turned to dust. Her mother worked whatever shifts were hiring, mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning rentals by the lake, weekends stocking shelves at the dollar store, stringing paychecks together the way other people strung lights at Christmas. Some months the electricity bill won, some months the rent did. What never changed was the quiet pact between them. They would make it through the week, and then make it through the next. School was where the world took inventory. Kids noticed shoes first. Clara's were always a half size off. Too long in the toe, too thin in the sole. Bought for $3 at the Goodwill bin because you'll grow into them, honey. She did, and by then the heels had already split. Coats came second. The winter she turned 12, her coat was a men's army green parka that smelled faintly of cedar and someone else's laundry soap. The boys in homeroom saluted when she walked in. "Goodwill girl," they'd whisper. "Charity kid." The words were small stones that somehow found their way into her pockets, heavy by the last bell. Her mother, Nancy, fought back with an iron and a gentle kind of defiance. She pressed collars flat, stitched buttons with dental floss when thread ran out, and wrote notes on napkins tucked into Clara's lunch. "You are not what they say." Still, the cafeteria had its own currency. Brand-name chips, new backpacks, the right logo on a T-shirt. Clara learned early that these things could quiet a room in ways perfect grades never did. She discovered invisibility by habit. Head down, homework and on time, no trouble. Sundays, when her mother wasn't scheduled, they walked through the church rummage sale before service, pretending it was just to say hello to the ladies at the bake table. Clara learned to read labels with a kind of hope. 100% cotton meant the shirt might last through spring. Gently used meant only one owner before her. Once, she found a pale blue cardigan soft as breath. She wore it every Tuesday until someone asked if she ever took it off. After that, she folded it into the back of the drawer and pretended she'd grown out of it. The teasing wasn't constant, only efficient. A glance at her shoes, a laugh when her pencil case unzipped to reveal an odd assortment of donated pens. The way a teacher hesitated before asking for field trip money, already knowing the answer. None of it was enough to send her home in tears every day. But it added up, interest compounding on a loan she hadn't taken out, a debt she didn't owe. At night, when the trailer moaned in the wind and her mother's alarm clock promised another early shift, Clara stared at the ceiling and negotiated with a future that felt as far away as the city lights she could not see. She promised that someday she would step into a store and choose something because she liked it, not because it fit. Books gave her the outline of escape. Guidance counselors talked about financial aid and first-generation scholarships. Teachers slid extra practice tests across her desk with a wink. Clara studied in the library until closing, the hum of the vending machines a steady companion. She learned to convert hours into grades and grades into possibilities. Each A was a small wedge in the door. Each recommendation letter felt like a hand on her back, saying, "Keep going." The day the envelope came, it was thicker than the others. Her mother set it on the table without comment, hands still damp from the sink. Clara opened it carefully, eyes tracking each line twice to be sure. Admission to a university in the city, a merit scholarship that covered tuition and most fees, work-study options for the rest. The paper trembled in her hands. Her mother reached for the letter, then for her, and for a long moment they didn't say anything at all. Silence could be heavy. Today it was light. That night, Clara folded her clothes for the next morning and laid the letter on top like a shield. The words "Goodwill girl" and "Charity kid" still lived in the walls of her bedroom, but they sounded thinner now, less sure of themselves. She thought of sidewalks that didn't break into gravel, of classrooms with windows that looked out over buildings instead of pines, of a campus where no one knew her coat had been someone else's first. She didn't imagine grandeur. She imagined a narrow bed, a quiet desk, and a door she could lock. She imagined waking up and choosing who she might be. The vow she'd made in whispers grew teeth. She would go. She would study. She would not come back the same. And whatever the city asked of her, late nights, early shifts, the ache of pretending she belonged until she did. She would pay it gladly. The next life was not promised, but it was printed black on white, with her name at the top, Clara Whitaker. The campus was bigger than anything Clara had ever known, not just in size, but in the quiet confidence that pulsed through its brick walkways and ivy-covered walls. Students carried themselves differently here, as if the future belonged to them by default. Clara still felt like she was borrowing hers, on loan, until someone realized she didn't belong. She worked evenings at the campus library and cleaned faculty offices on weekends, careful to stretch every dollar from her scholarship. Yet, even on the hardest days, there was a small, persistent thrill in knowing she was here at all. It was in her sophomore year that she first noticed Dr. Benjamin Cole. He was the youngest professor in the English department, recently returned from a fellowship in London, with a voice that made even the driest texts feel alive. His lectures were packed, not just because of the syllabus, but because students leaned forward when he spoke, as if language itself bent closer to listen. Clara sat near the back, scribbling notes furiously, afraid to raise her hand. He was older, composed, and seemed to belong to a world she could never touch. But small gestures have a way of opening doors. One afternoon, after class, Benjamin stopped her as she was gathering her books. "You have an interesting way of interpreting themes," he said, pointing to a note in her margin. "Have you ever considered publishing your essays?" She laughed nervously, assuming he was teasing. He wasn't. That moment, a brief exchange in an empty classroom, became the thread that pulled her deeper into his orbit. Their conversations stretched beyond literature. He asked about her background, and she, cautiously, shared pieces of it: the secondhand clothes, the single mother, the determination to leave it all behind. He listened without pity, which was rarer than she expected. "You know," he said once, "people like us don't come from the same places, but that doesn't mean we can't end up in the same rooms." It was the closest anyone had ever come to telling her she belonged. It started with coffee after office hours, then dinners at a quiet cafe far from campus. They talked about books and futures, about dreams spoken aloud for the first time. Clara knew the rules, knew what it meant to blur the line between student and professor. Friends whispered, some with envy, some with scorn. A senior warned her she was just a chapter in his career. Another professor hinted that Benjamin's reputation for charm preceded him. But Clara had spent her life being told what she couldn't have. This, the way he looked at her as if she were extraordinary, felt like the life she had been reaching for since childhood. By the end of the semester, the relationship had shifted from quiet companionship to something undeniable. They met in the city on weekends, where no one knew their names. He brought her used books annotated in his handwriting, and once, a small silver bracelet for her birthday. "A reminder," he said, fastening it around her wrist, "that you're more than where you started." It was a sentence she would repeat to herself on nights she felt like an imposter. Months later, Clara found herself staring at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test in the dim light of her dorm bathroom. Her heart hammered as possibilities unraveled. Fear, disbelief, and beneath it all, a strange, fragile joy. When she told Benjamin, he was silent at first, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair. Then, to her shock, he dropped to one knee beside the couch. "Marry me," he said, voice steady. "We'll build a life, our life, together." It wasn't the proposal of storybooks. There was no ring, no candlelight, just a question that felt like a door swinging open. Clara said yes before she had time to think of anything else. All the humiliation and scarcity of her past seemed to dissolve in that single moment. She wasn't the charity kid anymore. She was a woman chosen, loved, and promised a future that stretched far beyond the narrow roads of her childhood. As they sat together that night, hands intertwined, Benjamin talked about apartments and plans and how good she would be as a mother. Clara listened, barely hearing the details. What she held on to was the feeling that she had finally stepped into a world where the floor would not give way beneath her feet. The day Clara met Benjamin's mother was nothing like she had imagined. Agnes Cole lived in a sprawling brick house in an old neighborhood lined with elm trees and wrought iron fences, the kind of place Clara had only ever seen on television. She spent the bus ride rehearsing polite greetings in her head, smoothing the wrinkles from her thrift store dress until the fabric felt thin beneath her fingers. She knew she wasn't from their world, but she hoped kindness might bridge the distance. Agnes answered the door with a cool, appraising stare that traveled from Clara's scuffed flats to the second-hand cardigan she had chosen carefully that morning. "So," she said, folding her arms, "this is the girl." The word girl landed like an insult. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. Family portraits lined the hallway, generations of Coles in graduation robes, military uniforms, and tailored suits. Clara felt smaller with each step. They sat in the formal living room, where Clara perched nervously on the edge of a sofa that cost more than her mother's car. Agnes didn't bother with pleasantries. "Where did you say you were from again?" she asked. Clara told her the name of the small town. Agnes let out a short, humorless laugh. "I drove through there once. I didn't realize people actually lived there." Benjamin tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, but his mother wasn't finished. "You're still in school, correct? And cleaning offices on the weekends." Clara nodded, cheeks burning. "So my son, a tenured professor with a promising career, has chosen a girl who scrubs floors. Remarkable." Clara opened her mouth to speak, but closed it again. Benjamin sat beside her, staring into his coffee, saying nothing. Each silence was louder than the words that came before it. By the time Agnes called her a nobody from nowhere, Clara's vision blurred with tears. On the ride back, she told Benjamin she couldn't do it. "Your mother hates me. She thinks I'm worthless. Maybe she's right." Benjamin took her hand and assured her that Agnes would warm up, that she was set in her ways and just needed time. "She'll see who you are once she knows you," he promised. Clara wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, so she swallowed her doubts and nodded. The wedding, when it came, felt less like a celebration and more like a formality to be endured. There was no dress shopping, no flowers, no gathering of friends and family. They signed papers in a small courthouse office with beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. Benjamin kissed her cheek, quick and distracted, and said, "We're married. That's what matters." Clara told herself he was right, but as they walked out into the drizzle without a single photo or bouquet, the day felt unfinished, like a story missing its middle. The next morning, still wearing the glow of newlywed hope, Clara woke early and set the table for breakfast. She imagined they might talk about honeymoon plans or even look for a small apartment together. But Agnes had other plans. She was waiting in the kitchen with a large bowl of unwashed potatoes. "Here," she said, setting them down with a thud. "Peel these. This is your wedding feast." Clara stared at the potatoes, unsure if it was a joke. Agnes wasn't smiling. Benjamin, already pulling on his jacket, said he had to help his mother in the garden and left without another word. The sound of the door closing was louder than it should have been. Clara peeled the potatoes one by one, the knife slipping in her trembling hands. She thought of the courthouse, of the promises Benjamin had made, of the future she had pictured when she said yes. None of it looked like this, alone in a stranger's kitchen, peeling vegetables while her new husband walked away. By the time the bowl was full, her tears had fallen into the water, indistinguishable from the salt she had added to keep the potatoes from browning. In that quiet kitchen, beneath the weight of her new last name, Clara felt something shift. The girl who once believed love could erase the past now understood how heavy contempt could be, how it could fill a room, how it could settle over a life before it even began. The house on Hawthorne Street was beautiful by any measure. High ceilings, polished oak floors, sunlight filtering through lace curtains in the afternoons. But for Clara, it became a cage long before she realized it. Agnes ruled every inch of it with an iron certainty. She decided what meals were acceptable and how they should be prepared, correcting Clara's every move. "No, no, not like that," she would say, snatching the spoon from her hand. We don't fry chicken in cheap oil here. Even the way Clara folded laundry drew commentary. You must have learned this sloppiness in that little town of yours, Agnes would mutter, shaking her head. Clara tried to carve out small pockets of independence, a walk to the corner store, a visit to the library, but those too were quickly fenced in. Agnes demanded to know where she was going, for how long and why. If she was late, even by 10 minutes, the questions turned sharp. What kind of wife wanders around while her husband works? She would say, her tone dripping with accusation. The house grew smaller with each passing week, as if the walls themselves were inching closer. Benjamin, once attentive and warm, began to change too. At first, it was small things, missed dinners, distracted conversations. But then came the day he handed Clara an envelope with her university paperwork inside. I think it's time you took a break, he said. Pregnancy is hard. You need to focus on the baby. Clara stared at the withdrawal forms, her throat tightening. But I'm so close to finishing the semester, she protested. I can manage both. Benjamin shook his head, his voice calm but final. It's not up for debate. My mother and I both agree. The best thing for you, for the baby, is to rest. School can wait. And with that, her dream, the one she had built from library nights and scholarships and relentless studying, was quietly taken apart. Days blurred into weeks, and the list of chores multiplied. Clara cooked meals she didn't like, scrubbed floors that were already clean, and washed linens that barely needed it. If she moved too slowly, Agnes sighed loudly and muttered about how women from proper families knew how to run a household. If she did something differently, Agnes reminded her that in this family we have standards. The worst moments weren't the insults, but Benjamin's silence. When Clara told him how humiliated she felt, he only shrugged. She's old-fashioned, he said. Don't take it personally. When she asked for help, he reminded her that he worked all day to provide for them. You're lucky you don't have to worry about anything but the house, he said, as if that were a kindness. Pregnancy made everything heavier. Her body ached, her back throbbed, and some mornings nausea kept her curled on the bathroom floor. But chores waited, meals had to be made, and Agnes never missed a chance to point out that women have been doing this for centuries. Clara tried to remind herself why she stayed. She told herself that once the baby came, things would change, that Benjamin would soften, that Agnes would accept her, that the three of them would become a family. It was a fragile hope, but it was all she had. And yet, the loneliness was relentless. Benjamin worked late, sometimes not coming home until after she was asleep. Agnes spent hours on the phone with friends, talking about Clara as if she weren't in the next room. She means well, she'd say, but she's so simple. She'll learn. Clara would stand silently in the hallway, hand on the swell of her belly, and wonder if her child would grow up hearing those same words. Sometimes, at night, she would sit by the window long after the lights were out. The street lamps cast faint circles of gold on the sidewalk, and she would watch strangers pass beneath them, couples laughing, teenagers with backpacks slung over their shoulders, women walking home from work in clothes they had chosen for themselves. The sight made her chest ache. This was supposed to be the life she had dreamed of, a husband, a home, a family. Instead, it felt like she had traded one set of walls for another. The cage was prettier now, polished floors instead of cracked linoleum, lace curtains instead of faded blinds, but it was a cage nonetheless. And as winter turned to spring, Clara began to fear that when the baby came, the door would close for good. By the time Clara reached her 8th month of pregnancy, her body felt like borrowed territory. Swollen ankles, aching joints, a back that screamed with every step. Even simple tasks took twice as long, but Agnes never seemed to notice. Dust collects faster when a woman is idle, she said one March morning, pointing to the top shelf of a tall cabinet. Clara hesitated. The shelf was above her head, and she could feel the weight of her belly pulling her off balance. I don't think I should be climbing right now, she murmured. Agnes waved off her concern. It's just a chair, Clara. Women have been working through pregnancies since the dawn of time. Reluctantly, Clara fetched the old wooden chair from the pantry and climbed up, stretching to reach the dusty shelf. She had just run the rag across the back edge when the wood beneath her gave a sudden, sickening crack. The world tilted. For one horrifying second, she was weightless. Then came the crash, a sharp pain radiating up her spine, and the metallic taste of fear flooding her mouth. Agnes screamed her name, but the sound felt far away. The next moments blurred into sirens, bright lights, and paramedics, lifting her onto a stretcher as questions swirled above her head. How far along? Did she lose consciousness? Clara clutched her belly, whispering to the baby over and over, "Hold on. Please hold on." At the hospital, doctors spoke quickly and calmly. There was internal bleeding, they said. They had to deliver the baby now. Everything happened in flashes. A consent form thrust into her hands. Benjamin's face pale and tight as he arrived just in time to squeeze her fingers. The antiseptic chill of the operating room. Clara counted the ceiling tiles until the anesthesia pulled her under. When she woke, the room was quiet except for the steady beep of a monitor. A nurse leaned over her with a practiced smile. "You have a little fighter," she said. Clara's heart leapt. He's small, but he's breathing on his own. Tears slipped down her cheeks as they placed the tiny bundle in her arms. His skin was pink and warm, his fist no bigger than her thumb. "Victor," she whispered, the name forming without thought. "Because he survived." Agnes appeared at the foot of the bed, eyes red and swollen. She took a hesitant step forward. "Clara," she began, her voice trembling, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have asked you to do that. I wasn't thinking." Clara stared at her, too exhausted to speak. Agnes had never apologized to her before. Now, she reached for Clara's hand and held it, awkward and unsure, but genuine. Something in her posture had shifted. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something closer to regret. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and anxious hours by the incubator. Victor was healthy but fragile, and every small cry sent a jolt through Clara's chest. Agnes visited the hospital every day, bringing homemade soup and sitting quietly by the crib. Once, Clara woke in the middle of the night to find the older woman whispering to Victor through the glass, tears tracking down her cheeks. At home, life rearranged itself around the new rhythm of motherhood. Clara's days became a cycle of feedings, diaper changes, and hushed lullabies. Her body ached, her mind swam with exhaustion. But every time Victor curled his tiny fingers around hers, the world felt briefly perfect. For the first time in a long time, Clara felt needed, not as a maid or a scapegoat, but as a mother. Benjamin, however, seemed to drift further away. He spent longer hours at the university and often slipped into the guest room, claiming he didn't want to wake the baby. When Clara asked for help, he would smile faintly and say, "I'm terrified I'll drop him," as if fear excused absence. "I'm just so tired," he added, and disappeared behind the door of his study. Nights grew quieter without him. Clara would rock Victor by the window, humming softly while the city hummed back beyond the glass. She told herself Benjamin just needed time, that fatherhood would settle into his bones eventually. But as weeks turned into months, the space beside her in bed stayed cold, and his footsteps echoed down the hall instead of toward her. Still, when Victor's eyes fluttered open and locked onto hers, Clara felt something stronger than disappointment. She felt purpose. The world could shrink and harden around her, but in that small heartbeat pressed against her chest, she found a reason to keep going. And for now, that was enough. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that passed without note. Victor was napping, the house smelled faintly of chamomile tea, and Clara was folding laundry in the living room when Benjamin walked in with an unfamiliar tension in his face. He didn't sit, didn't kiss her hello. Instead, he remained standing by the doorway, hands buried in his pockets. "I got an offer," he said, his voice steady but distant. "A teaching position in China. 5 years. It's a huge opportunity, prestigious, well-funded. The kind of thing that could change everything for my career. Clara blinked at him, unsure she'd heard correctly. 5 years, she repeated. When? In 2 months. He still hadn't looked at her. Her heart lurched. And Victor? Me. Benjamin sighed, the way someone might sigh when a meeting runs long. It's not a place for a baby. Or for you, not right now. The conditions, the language barrier, it wouldn't make sense. It's better if you stay here. My mother will help. You'll manage. Clara stared at him as if the floor had shifted. Manage? He's your son. I'm your wife. You're talking about leaving us. I'm not leaving, Benjamin replied, but the words rang hollow. I'll call, all right. It's just 5 years. 5 years is Victor's whole childhood, Clara whispered. Please, Benjamin, don't do this. Don't leave us behind. But he was already turning away, talking about logistics, storage, his teaching schedule, as if her pleas were background noise. Clara followed him down the hallway, begging him to reconsider, but he didn't stop. Not once did he ask what she wanted. 2 months later, he was gone. At first, Benjamin kept his word. A call once a week, a photo of a new classroom, a message about how busy he was. Clara clung to those scraps, rereading them at night while Victor slept on her chest. But the calls grew shorter, the gaps longer. Weeks turned into months, and then the messages stopped altogether. Emails went unanswered. Packages she sent to his university address were returned unopened. One evening, as she watched Victor reach for a toy with clumsy, determined fingers, Clara realized she didn't know if Benjamin had even seen a picture of his son in 6 months. The thought hollowed her out. Life without him was harder, but clearer. Bills didn't wait for heartbreak, so Clara took a part-time job at a local grocery store, working nights after Victor was asleep. During the day, she enrolled in an online degree program, determined to finish the education that had been stripped from her. Agnes, once her harshest critic, became her unlikely ally. She helped watch Victor, encouraged Clara to study, and even surprised her with a laptop purchased from her savings. "You're too smart to stop now," she said one evening, gently patting Clara's shoulder. Slowly, a new rhythm took shape. Mornings began with Victor's babbling and ended with online lectures playing softly through her headphones. Clara learned to stretch every dollar, to balance bottles with textbooks, to carry exhaustion like a second skin. It wasn't the life she had imagined when she said, yes, in that tiny courthouse, but it was theirs, hers and Victor's. Agnes, too, softened in ways Clara hadn't thought possible. She read to Victor from the worn books Benjamin had loved as a boy, knitted him blankets, and sometimes, when she thought Clara wasn't looking, whispered apologies she'd never spoken aloud. They weren't the family Clara had hoped for, but they were a family nonetheless. Nights were still long and sometimes lonely, but when Victor's small hand wrapped around her finger, Clara felt the ache ease. The future remained uncertain. Benjamin might never return, might never care, but she no longer waited for his shadow to fill the doorway. Her world had narrowed to 2 faces, a son whose laugh could shatter any darkness, and a woman who had once despised her but now shared her tea at the kitchen table. It wasn't easy, but it was peaceful. And for Clara Whitaker, peace was more than she'd dared to hope for. It was a late autumn afternoon when everything changed again. Clara was chopping vegetables for dinner, while Victor built towers with his wooden blocks in the living room. Agnes was reading aloud from the newspaper, her voice steady as always, when it suddenly faltered. There was a thud, soft but wrong, and when Clara turned, she saw Agnes slump sideways in her chair, the paper sliding to the floor. "Agnes!" Clara screamed, rushing to her side. The older woman's face was pale, her right arm limp, her words tumbling into incoherent sounds. Clara called 911 with shaking hands, whispering reassurances as sirens drew closer. "Hold on. Please hold on." At the hospital, fluorescent lights hummed above her as doctors spoke in measured tones. Agnes had suffered a major stroke. She was alive, but the right side of her body was paralyzed, and her speech was badly impaired. With therapy, she may regain some mobility, one doctor explained, but she will need constant care, likely for the rest of her life. When they suggested a long-term care facility, Clara shook her head. "No," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "She's family. She'll come home with us." The doctor hesitated. "It will be a heavy responsibility," he warned. Clara only nodded. "She's like a mother to me now. I'm not abandoning her." The weeks that followed were grueling. Agnes returned home in a wheelchair, her speech limited to broken phrases, her frustration spilling out in tears she tried to hide. Clara left her job at the grocery store. There was no way to manage shifts and full-time care, and found herself juggling the needs of a growing boy and a recovering woman with barely a moment to breathe. At night, after Victor was asleep and Agnes dozed in her recliner, Clara baked in the kitchen. Pies, cookies, muffins, anything that could be sold at the weekend farmer's market or ordered by neighbors. It wasn't much, but it kept the lights on and the pantry stocked. Despite the exhaustion, something unexpected bloomed in that small house. Victor, now a bright, curious boy with his father's eyes and his mother's resilience, became Agnes's greatest joy. Every morning he ran to her wheelchair and climbed into her lap, clutching picture books and narrating the stories in his own dramatic voice. Agnes listened intently, laughing when she could and pointing to words she wanted him to repeat. Speech therapy sessions became family rituals. Clara would sit on the couch beside Agnes, gently guiding her through syllables, while Victor clapped and cheered every small victory. "Say sunshine, Grandma," he'd coax. "Sunshine." And when the word came out slurred but recognizable, he threw his arms around her neck. "You did it," he'd shout, and Agnes's eyes would shine with tears. Evenings were their favorite time. Clara would light a small candle on the table, and the three of them would share dinner, sometimes simple bowls of soup, sometimes the slightly imperfect pastries from her nighttime baking. They told stories, laughed over Victor's jokes, and, on quiet nights, listened to the rain against the windows. The house that had once felt like a prison now pulsed with warmth. Clara often thought about the irony of it all, how the woman who had once called her worthless had become someone she now tucked into bed every night, someone whose gratitude came in the squeeze of a hand or the hint of a smile. Agnes, softened by vulnerability, often reached for Clara's hand and whispered, "Thank you." And Clara, meaning every word, would answer, "Your family." There were still difficult days. Some mornings Agnes refused therapy, too frustrated to try. Some nights Clara cried quietly at the kitchen table, overwhelmed by bills and exhaustion. But then Victor would appear in his pajamas, curl into her lap, and ask her to tell him stories about the town she'd grown up in. Or Agnes would pat her hand and murmur, "Good girl," her voice still clumsy but full of love. And in those moments, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in years. Home. Not the kind built by money or marriage, but the kind stitched together by shared struggle, forgiveness, and love. It was a fragile piece, but it was real, and in its quiet corners, Clara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found their family. She didn't know then that peace is often the stillness before the storm. 3 years slipped by in quiet, measured days. Victor was 4 now, curious, imaginative, and endlessly talkative, and Agnes had regained enough strength to walk short distances with a cane. Life was still hard, but it had become familiar, even peaceful. Clara had learned to live without Benjamin's presence, without his voice or his promises. She no longer checked her email hoping for a reply, no longer replayed old messages late at night. The silence had settled around them like an old quilt, not warm but bearable. Then, on a rainy afternoon in late September, that silence shattered. Clara was helping Agnes practice her steps near the kitchen table, while Victor built a fort out of couch cushions. She heard the front door open, footsteps heavy and unfamiliar. For a moment, she thought it might be the landlord. But then she heard a voice she hadn't heard in years, deeper, colder, but unmistakable. "Clara." She turned, the room tilting slightly. Benjamin stood in the doorway, suitcase by his side, rainwater dripping from his coat. Beside him was a young woman, barely older than Clara's students at the community college, with glossy black hair and a sharp, assessing gaze. She clung to Benjamin's arm as if she'd always belonged there. Before Clara could speak, Benjamin dropped the news like a stone. "This is Nika. She's going to be living here." The words didn't register at first. "Living here?" Clara echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Benjamin said simply, as if explaining something obvious. "Things have changed. I've changed. And this," he gestured toward the young woman, who smiled like a cat, "is the future. You need to move out." Clara stared at him. "Move out? This is my home. Victor's home." Benjamin's expression hardened. "My home. My name is still on the deed. And Victor will stay here with me. It's time you stopped clinging to something that's over." Nika stepped forward, her heels clicking against the hardwood. "He's right," she said, her voice sugar-sweet and venomous. "Honestly, I don't know how you've managed all this time. It must be exhausting playing housekeeper." Clara blinked. "Excuse me." "Oh, don't be offended," Nika replied with a smirk. "I just assumed, well, from the look of things, the baking, the cleaning, the way you fuss over his mother, I thought you were staff." The room went still. Clara felt something hot rise in her chest. Anger, humiliation, heartbreak all tangled together. She stepped closer, her voice low and trembling but steady. "Be careful what you say in this house," she warned, "because if you push me too far, you might find yourself at the bottom of those stairs before you even unpack." Nika's smile faltered for the first time. Benjamin quickly stepped between them. "Enough," he snapped. "Clara, you're embarrassing yourself. This bitterness, it's exactly why I don't want Victor growing up around you. You're stuck in the past. You're old and provincial. And frankly, you're holding everyone back." The words hit harder than any slap. Old, provincial. He said them so casually, as if they were facts rather than knives. Clara looked at the man she had once loved, the man who had promised her a future, and saw a stranger. "Does Victor know you're here?" she asked quietly. Benjamin shrugged. "He'll adapt. And Nika will be good for him. Younger, more energetic. Even my mother will like her once she gets to know her." Agnes, silent until now, gripped her cane so tightly her knuckles turned white. Victor peeked out from behind the couch, confusion clouding his small face. Clara knelt and pulled him close, her heart breaking as she whispered, "It's okay, baby. It's okay." But nothing about this was okay. The man who had once kissed her forehead and promised forever was now throwing her out of the only home she had built. The boy who had been the center of her universe was suddenly a pawn in Benjamin's new life. And the woman who had called her worthless was now, apparently, replaceable too. Clara stood there, holding Victor against her, the sound of rain still tapping against the windows. The humiliation was suffocating, not because Benjamin had betrayed her again, but because this time he didn't even see her as someone worth betraying. She was just disposable. And for the first time in years, Clara felt the faint stirrings of something sharper than grief, a cold, steady resolve beginning to form beneath the ruin. For the first time since Benjamin's return, Clara slept without tears. Not because the pain was gone, far from it, but because something colder, sharper had taken its place. Humiliation had burned itself into resolve. When Benjamin repeated his demand the next morning, "Pack your things, Clara. Be gone by the end of the week," she simply looked him in the eye and said, "No." He laughed at first, a dry, incredulous sound. "You don't have a choice," he said, gesturing around the living room. "This is my property. My name's on everything." "Is it?" she asked quietly. It turned out it wasn't. Benjamin had purchased the apartment before their marriage. But after Victor's birth, the deed had been amended to include both of their names, a fact Benjamin had either forgotten or assumed Clara was too naive to know. But Clara had kept every document, every receipt, every letter. And now, She spread them across the kitchen table like pieces on a chessboard. She met with a lawyer the following week, a calm, meticulous woman named Andrea Morales who listened to her story without interruption. "You have a strong case," Andrea said, sliding her glasses down her nose. "He abandoned both you and his child for over 3 years, provided no financial support, and now he's attempting to evict you from a jointly owned property. We'll challenge the divorce petition, seek full custody, and request child support and spousal maintenance." For weeks, Clara became a collector of evidence. She dug through old emails showing Benjamin's absence, bank statements proving she had paid household expenses alone, and Victor's pediatric records listing her as the sole guardian present. She kept records of Agnes's care, hospital discharge papers, physical therapy notes, even photos of the modifications she'd made to the house for accessibility. Agnes herself, her speech still halting but her memory sharp, insisted on testifying. "She took care of me," she said one afternoon, gripping Clara's hand. "Not him. Her." Even the neighbors rallied to her side. Mrs. Ellison from across the street offered to testify that Benjamin hadn't been seen once in 3 years. Mr. Patel, who often bought Clara's pies, wrote a sworn statement about how she had supported Victor and Agnes on her own. Bit by bit, Clara built not just a case, but a portrait of truth that no courtroom could ignore. When the day of the hearing arrived, the tension inside the courthouse felt like a held breath. Benjamin strode in with an expensive attorney and an air of superiority, Nika at his side in a tailored suit. Clara sat quietly beside Andrea, Victor's small hand tucked into hers. Agnes was there too, seated near the front, her cane resting against the bench. Benjamin's attorney argued first, painting Clara as a dependent homemaker who refused to move on and hindered her husband's career. He claimed Benjamin had offered reasonable arrangements and that Victor would thrive under his father's care. Clara listened without flinching. Then it was Andrea's turn. She began by detailing Benjamin's disappearance, the dates he stopped contacting Clara, the absence of financial support, the lack of involvement in his son's life. She presented receipts of Clara's income from her baking business, evidence of her enrollment in online courses, and statements from neighbors describing her as a devoted mother and caregiver. Then she held up photos of Agnes in the hospital and letters from her doctors, documents Benjamin had never even signed. "For 3 years," Andrea said, her voice steady but sharp, "this woman cared for his mother, raised his child, and maintained the home, all without a single dollar or word from him. And now he returns and demands she leave. That is not justice. That is abandonment followed by cruelty." Benjamin's composure cracked under cross-examination. He stammered when asked why he hadn't visited Victor. He had no explanation for why he hadn't paid a cent toward household expenses. And when shown the property deed, with Clara's name clearly printed beneath his, even his attorney's confident mask slipped. Nika shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Andrea addressed the court one final time. "This apartment is not his alone," she said. "It is a marital asset, and no amount of arrogance changes the fact that he cannot simply throw her and their child out." The judge's ruling would take weeks, but the tone in the courtroom had shifted. Benjamin no longer looked triumphant. He looked cornered. And Nika, once so smug, sat frozen as she realized the fresh start she had envisioned didn't include taking Clara's home. As they left the courthouse that day, Clara held Victor's hand and exhaled deeply. She had walked into that room feeling like a discarded wife. She walked out as something else entirely, a mother, a fighter, and a woman who refused to be erased. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, dignity didn't feel like a memory. It felt like a weapon, and Clara intended to wield it. The verdict came on a warm afternoon in late spring. Clara sat in the courtroom with Victor beside her, his small legs swinging nervously beneath the bench, while Agnes gripped her hand with surprising strength. The judge's voice was calm, deliberate, and final, each sentence landing like a stone in still water. Custody of the minor child, Victor Cole, will be awarded to his mother, Clara Whitaker, the judge declared. Given the father's extended absence, lack of financial contribution, and failure to maintain a relationship with the child, the court finds it in the child's best interest to remain with his primary caregiver. Benjamin shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer leaning in to whisper something he ignored. Furthermore, the judge continued, the residence at 412 Hawthorne Street shall remain the primary home of the child and his mother. Mr. Cole has no legal authority to evict Mrs. Whitaker, as the property is jointly owned. He is ordered to pay monthly child support and spousal maintenance. Any attempt to withhold payment will result in legal action, including potential wage garnishment. The words hung in the air. For a long moment, the only sound was the rustling of papers as the bailiff recorded the decision. Clara sat frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. It was over. Benjamin stood, his face pale and disbelieving. "This is ridiculous," he hissed, his voice carrying across the quiet courtroom. "She's manipulating the system. I'm his father." The judge looked at him over the rim of his glasses. "You abandoned your family for over 3 years, Mr. Cole. You have obligations, not privileges, and this court will enforce them." Nika, seated a row behind Benjamin, stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. But as the weight of the decision settled in, her composure began to crack. By the time they stepped out into the courthouse hallway, she was already pulling her hand from Benjamin's. "You didn't tell me she owned half the apartment," she said, her voice sharp. "You didn't tell me about the support payments either." "Nika, wait." Benjamin reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "I'm not signing up for this," she snapped, and with that she turned and walked away, her heels clicking down the marble corridor until the sound faded entirely. Benjamin stood there, stunned and alone, the future he'd so confidently planned dissolving around him. Clara watched without a word. She felt no triumph, no bitterness, just a profound, bone-deep stillness. He had tried to erase her, and instead he had erased himself. In the weeks that followed, the house on Hawthorne Street settled into a new rhythm. Victor built elaborate forts in the living room, his laughter filling the rooms that had once echoed with silence. Agnes, though slower now, insisted on helping in the kitchen, her hands steadying Clara's as they kneaded dough together. And Clara, no longer the frightened, uncertain woman who once peeled potatoes in tears, found herself breathing easier with each passing day. Benjamin's visits were rare and brief. He brought gifts Victor barely looked at and asked questions he didn't really want answered. He spoke often of getting back on his feet, but there was a weariness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. For Clara, it no longer mattered. His approval, his absence, his regret, none of it defined her anymore. One evening, months after the final hearing, Clara stood by the kitchen window as the sun slipped below the skyline. The city stretched before her, golden and alive, its streets humming with possibilities. In the yard, Victor chased a ball across the grass, his laughter carried on the breeze. Agnes watched from her chair on the porch, smiling faintly as the boy darted past her feet. Clara felt something stir deep inside her, a quiet realization that hummed like a heartbeat. "I am not that girl anymore," she thought. Not the one in second-hand shoes. Not the one mocked for what she lacked. Not the woman begging to be seen. She was a mother who had raised her son alone, a daughter to a woman who had once despised her, a survivor of betrayal, humiliation, and abandonment. And now she was something more. She was the woman who had stood her ground, who had fought not just for a home, but for dignity, who had turned a life built on charity into one built on choice. Victor's laughter rang out again, bright and unrestrained. Clara smiled, letting the last of the day's light wash over her face. She had once sworn to leave behind the small, dusty town that had shaped her, to become someone no one could laugh at again. Now, watching her son play beneath a sky painted in gold, she knew she had done more than that. She had won.